Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. This week, listeners, we have the great pleasure, although I think we're going to have a pretty sober discussion, of having Hal Brands, AEI's scholar on all things foreign policy, global strategy. He's also at Johns Hopkins, but we are very proud that he's with us so much and so often and writes so frequently on these very challenging issues. So Hal, we're going to go around the world here, but I did want to say to you that not so long ago you wrote a book about the long twilight struggle that we face with China. I can't remember right now the title of that book. What was it called?
Twilight Struggle.
And it was kind of a sober assessment of an incremental, step-by-step, similar engagement with a adversary similar to the long-term struggle we had with the Soviet Union in the Cold War period. But things have gotten a lot hotter since then. And are we no longer in a Cold War, but are we in a hot war?
I think the major thing that's changed since I wrote that book, which would have been in 2020 or 2021, was that today the international scene looks a little bit less like the early Cold War and a little bit more like the period running up to World War II. And you don't want to overdraw that comparison because there are a million differences. But the challenge before World War II was that you had three separate regional conflicts in Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East, sort of around the Mediterranean Rim, and then in East Asia that intensified, and they got more interwoven as the bad guys did more and more together in those areas. And that's a little bit what's happening today, where, again, you have three regional crises in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and then in the Western Pacific, and then at the same time you have a set of autocratic actors that are doing more and more together because they have a common interest in destabilizing the existing state of things. And so fortunately, the U.S.-China rivalry has not yet gone hot, although in some ways it's gotten a little bit hotter. But of course, we do have hot wars in Europe and the Middle East, and there's significant potential for escalation in both places.
It certainly does feel like a gathering storm, which was the term Winston Churchill used to describe the pre-1940, 1939 period in Europe and around the world. And let's start in the Middle East, where we're recording this a couple days after Iran launches a series of missiles into Israel. It looks like this episode was similar to the previous one, where most of the missiles were shot down. And is that Iran rattling a saber but not really doing anything serious, or is this a sign of much more serious war?
It's a little bit of both. I'm sure that there are officials in the Iranian regime that are realistic enough to know that Israel's got really good missile defenses and they've got support from the United States and other actors, and so some large number of the missiles that the Iranians shot off were likely to either be intercepted or to misfire in one way or another. That said, the Iranians gave everybody a lot less advance warning this time than they did last time. Last time, they sort of ostentatiously prepared for this in a way that actually gave the U.S. and Israel more time to get their defenses together. This time, they did not. But there's also the more basic point, which is that you don't shoot 180 missiles at another country, many of them targeting population centers, unless you're willing to kill a lot of people. And so I think that the Israeli government takes this really seriously. They don't view it as sort of a modest attack that was swatted aside. And I think the Israeli response is going to be bigger this time. If you remember last time, it was sort of a very targeted response going after some air defenses associated with a base near the Iranian nuclear program. The lesson the Israelis will take away is that that response wasn't enough to deter Iran from doing it again. So it's going to be bigger this time.
When I've examined what's going on in the Middle East, it contrasts with what I thought was going on in the Middle East when I was growing up, which was very much a conflict between the Palestinians and Israel over the creation of Israel and the loss of rights or property of the Palestinian people. And I often think on campuses, these kids that are saying these silly things, they think this is about the Palestinians. But Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, it's really more about Iran than it is the Palestinians. The Iranians are not fighting for Palestinian freedom or independence. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I would further say it's never really been about Palestine. And so even if you go back to the invasion of Israel by several Arab countries during the War of Independence in 1948, 1949, those invasions were not really motivated by sympathy for plight of the Palestinians or a desire to defend Palestinian self-determination. It was more about desires for aggrandizement and rivalries within the world of Arab nation states. What has changed is that for several decades, the strategic problem was that there was this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians had the support, albeit somewhat insincere, from the biggest, most powerful Arab states in the region, Egypt being the most important of them. That has changed. It started to change in the late 1970s, and now you have radical Palestinian factions that are backed by Iran, despite the sectarian split there. And many of the most powerful Arab states are now tacitly or openly cooperating with Israel. And so the geopolitical alignments have changed. What hasn't changed is that Iran is very instrumental in its use of the Palestinian factions and basically uses them to advance its geopolitical agenda rather than out of any genuine sympathy for someone living in Jenin or Hebron.
The United States, in the Trump administration, there was the Abraham Accords, and there was a sense that really path-breaking things were happening between Israel and moderate Arab states. Now, that part of the world's on fire. The moderate Arab states are sort of shrinking back into their quietness, and there's a war going on. Was there something the Biden administration did that made this happen, or would this have happened anyway? And also, given that at least in terms of the rhetoric, the Trump world feels is that they're even stronger supporters of Israel than the Biden world. What had happened there with regard to the way the United States put itself in the world that led to this current outbreak of violence and war?
The first comment I'd make on that is you don't want to overstate this point, because Hamas, since its founding, has never felt like it needed an excuse to try to kill Israelis. In fact, if you go back and read the original charter of that organization, it's pretty explicit in terms of what Hamas thinks should happen to Israel and the people who live there. That said, there does seem to have been a certain sense of urgency to carry off the October 7th attacks sooner rather than later, because Hamas saw that the U.S., under the Biden administration, which in some ways had picked this up from the Trump administration, was trying to broker a diplomatic normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that would have the effect of isolating Iran in the region, but also isolating Hamas by basically moving toward normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors without any underlying resolution of the Palestinian question. And so, in a sense, the Biden and Trump administrations had this in common, which they thought you could depressurize the region by promoting better ties between Israel and key Arab states without necessarily making progress on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. I think what the October 7th and its aftermath have shown is that was a little bit of a problematic assumption. And what Hamas achieved, in a sense, although achieved is the wrong word because this was such a gruesome, brutal effort, was to put the Palestinian issue back at a higher level of visibility within regional and international affairs. And so it remains the case today that Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, has said pretty explicitly he doesn't particularly care about the Palestinian cause. But he clearly feels that it would be politically problematic to go ahead with diplomatic normalization with Israel at this point.
Yes, but my point that I think you made, which is that the Biden administration policies in the Middle East were a continuation of the Trump administration policies in the Middle East, and if the Trump administration remained in power, this Hamas would have felt just as threatened as they did feel threatened. They still might have done this, and we could be in the same situation regardless of which presidency was in power.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the overall thrust of U.S. policy on these issues hasn't changed dramatically between, say, 2017 and 2022.
Okay, one more question about the Middle East. The Biden administration makes a strong point that the American soldiers and American arms, actual actions are not part of what's happening in Ukraine, and they're not part of what's happening in the South China Sea. But American soldiers are deployed in the Middle East, and they are carrying out missions. And when you think of sort of global strategy, I mean, how much are you thinking about the fact that we could wake up tomorrow and find that 50 American soldiers were killed in this battle that's going on in the Middle East? Isn't that correct?
Well, we've had 5 U.S. personnel killed in action in the Middle East over the past year, 3 of them in the Iranian proxy drone attack on the base just inside Jordan, and 2 who were lost in a naval interdiction mission, basically trying to prevent Iran from shipping arms to the Houthis. And the longer this goes on, the more the chances of an incident that lead to higher numbers of U.S. casualties go up. That could happen because you get an escalatory cycle involving Iran and Israel, and the U.S. gets drawn in. It could happen because the Houthis get lucky and hit a U.S. warship with a drone or a missile. There's a lot of concern now that maybe the Russians are thinking about arming the Houthis with anti-ship cruise missiles, which would pose a pretty significant threat to U.S. warships and not just to commercial shipping. And there's just the larger challenge that the U.S. has a lot of forces deployed in the Middle East right now, 2 carrier strike groups, a bunch of naval surface assets, lots of tactical air power, lots of missile defense assets. And so this is really consuming a lot of U.S. military attention and energy right now.
And didn't they just conduct an operation, a sort of special operation against terrorists in Syria? Or it seemed to me I've read recently that they are still in the battle against the terrorists.
We still have forces that are deployed in Syria as part of the counter-ISIS campaign. And, of course, U.S. Naval vessels were involved in trying to shoot down some of the missiles that Iran launched at Israel this week.
So I guess what I want to ask, as a global strategist, would you be advising the president to put more of our military apparatus into that region? Would you be worried about having too much and being too exposed to potential losses that could lead to even greater involvement?
Well, I think what the past year has shown, maybe the past 2 years have shown, is that how you slice the pie matters a lot, but the pie is just too small, right? And so the problem the U.S. has right now is that it doesn't have enough precision-guided munitions, for instance, to really get tough with the Houthis while also preserving its readiness for a conflict elsewhere, right? It's stretching its Navy very thin. The size of the Navy has shrunk considerably over the past couple of decades, and there just aren't enough surface assets to go around. We don't have enough missile defense assets and so on and so forth. And so we can argue about what is the proper level of U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. But the basic problem we have right now is we've got 3 theaters worth of trouble, and we don't have 3 theaters worth of resources.
So your concern is not so much about exposing them to potential casualties as it is not having enough to put them in, to be effective.
Well, you never want to expose U.S. personnel to casualties, but I think there is an interesting debate to be had about what actually would be the best way of managing the dangers to U.S. personnel involved in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Is it to continue with this largely defensive mission forever, or is it to try to ramp up the pressure and see if you can't have more of a deterrent effect?
Okay, so let's turn to Europe and Ukraine. The most recent news and reported by AEI scholars who monitor the war in Ukraine is that Russia has slogged through to take another town. It's pretty discouraging. What should the United States do?
One important thing to keep in mind here is that the reason it makes so much news when the Russians take this town or that is that they've taken a grand total of about 4 towns over the past year and a half, right? And so it's not as though the Russians are rolling forward with a great amount of speed. That said, the trends on the battlefield are not great for Ukraine right now. They're probably going to lose more territory before the end of the year. And the real challenge is that I don't think anybody in Kiev or Washington has a realistic theory of success right now. How what we are doing is going to lead to a resolution of the war on favorable terms. So I think the big question for the next administration is going to be how do you get to that favorable resolution? How do you define it, and how do you get there? My hunch is that whatever you think a decent resolution looks like, unless it's just forcing Ukraine to make peace on whatever terms it can get, which I don't think would be a particularly good idea, it's going to require significantly more U.S. and European assistance to get there, because at the bare minimum, you're going to have to show Putin that Ukraine is going to be able to defend effectively for the indefinite future and create some sort of threat that Russia's position will deteriorate as the war goes on, either because it's going to be subject to more significant, deeper strikes within Russia, or because Russian casualties are going to reach a point sometime where Ukraine might be able to take the offensive again. Those are big asks. It remains to be seen what sort of the feasibility of that is. But short of those sorts of steps, I don't see a path to a successful outcome or a successful negotiation even for Ukraine.
What has Russia gained? I mean, if you go on the other side of the trenches and you're on the Russian occupied side of Ukraine, if the settlement is achieved and peace is established in the sort of a stalemate, what will be the life of the part of Ukraine that's controlled by Russia? Is it one of those sort of they made a desert and called it peace?
Yeah, it'll be pretty awful in the sense that many of these parts of Ukraine are thoroughly devastated right now. The Russians aren't going to have the capacity or, frankly, much of an interest in rebuilding them once the war is over, and they're probably going to be subject to a fairly heavy-handed Russian occupation. And so sort of from our Enlightenment perspective, Russia has not achieved much, and the war doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think what we've learned over the past couple of years is that long-tenured dictators don't always see the world the same way that you or I might, Robert. And I think that Putin really does feel that this is an important quasi-existential conflict for Russia, that he's not just fighting against Ukraine, he's fighting against this larger collective West that in his view is Russia's existential foe. And so he's willing to invest and sink quite a lot into that.
Yeah, but my point was that if he has gained so little and it's an awful life, and Ukraine's independence west of the line remains in place, could one say, in the language of Long Twilight Struggle, we'll pause here and win eventually?
The we being
the
us,
we
or the
being
Russians?
the West. We being Ukraine.
We're the good guys. We're not Putin right now.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
all right. So yes, although it depends on what happens after the armistice or the ceasefire or the peace or whatever brings it into the fighting. So Russia will have accomplished one very important thing if they basically just end the fighting, wherever the line happens to be, which is that they will have further weakened the norm against non-aggression and territorial conquest, which is sort of the fundamental building block, in my view, of the post-1945 international order.
Well, now stop, Hal. Stop. I thought you were going to say post falling of the Berlin Wall order. But post-1945 order, for most of that period, or for a long period of that period, there was an Iron Curtain just across Europe where most of these countries were on the other side of it. Germany was divided. Berlin was a divided city. So are you celebrating the status of the world 1955?
I'm celebrating the fact that prior to 1945, it was common for states to be wiped off the map all the time. Just ask someone from Poland, right? And since then, it has become much, much less common. There's only one country that has sort of fallen off the map since 1945 due to conquest, which is South Vietnam. And that is a huge advance in international affairs. It's a huge testament to the stability of the post-war international system. And you don't have to like everything about the world that came about after 1945 to recognize that advance is worth preserving.
Well, but Poland could be said to have been off the map for the entire period till after Solidarity.
And thanks to the leadership of the United States and its friends and the international order that they tried to create, Poland was, eventually found
reclaimed
its liberation. Right.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So, okay. So, I'm still so let's go back to how we get Russia to back down or to retreat. Is that possible?
It depends on what the definition of back down is. If the definition of back down is can you convince Russia that it's not going to be successful in marching into Kyiv and imposing terms on the Ukrainian government? Yeah, I think you can probably do that. If the question is, can you kick Russia out of every inch of Ukrainian territory that it holds, I'm a lot less optimistic about that. We would just need to see either a fundamentally different Ukrainian military than we've seen so far, or a fundamentally different level of Western involvement in the war than we have seen so far.
I was at an event the other day, and the CIA director was there. And, I'd been at events with United States military officials previously, but I had not been at an event where the CIA director was. And he said something kind of in an offhand way, which I presume and maybe it doesn't matter at all. But he said, the CIA has had personnel in Ukraine for some time. So, is that right? I mean, American CIA assets are in Ukraine. Is that correct?
The only thing I know about this is what I read in the newspapers, but it makes sense to reason that there has been a U.S. intelligence presence in Ukraine for some while.
And I don't make it. I think that's probably good. I'd like us to be helping as much as possible. But I just we are involved in these conflicts. There's no question about it in a big way.
Yeah, and I think the thing that gets a lot of attention in the press is, are the Ukrainians going to get this weapon system or that weapon system? And those are important debates. But there's also sort of a whole behind-the-scenes aspect of U.S. involvement, which is sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians, sometimes helping them plan military operations and things of that nature. And those things are incredibly important as well.
Last question. In one of your pieces you wrote about, you did a great comparison of the Biden foreign policy and the Trump administration foreign policy. But one of the things that you chalked up, I believe, on the Biden side was the presiding over the increased European involvement in the war in Ukraine and investment in military resources. Is that, have I got that right? And how significant is Europe's response to Russia? Do you count it as a plus, a C, or an F?
think it's probably a B. On the eastern front of NATO, Poland, some of the Baltic states, Romania, it's an A- or even an A+ if you're thinking about Poland in particular. Is as you move farther west, there's usually less urgency, right? And so the Germans have been hemming and hawing about fulfilling some of the commitments and plans they offered up right after the invasion of Ukraine, for instance. The general trend is in the right direction. There are still huge capability shortfalls on the European side. In terms of who gets credit for the progress going in the right direction, I think most of the credit has to go to Vladimir Putin. And so if you think about sort of when the big jumps in European spending have come, it's after Crimea, sort of in 2015, 2016, and then after the invasion of Ukraine. And so U.S. officials have been pushing the Europeans on spending for a long, long time, but there's nothing like a no-kidding threat to actually sort of light a fire.
Yeah, I mean, they're done better, but they still could do more.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's turn to China and Asia. Your book was called The Long Twilight Struggle or The Twilight Struggle. It was about China. Are you really, really concerned that we're being distracted by Ukraine and Israel and Middle East when the real challenge in the world is China?
I think that China probably poses the biggest overall threat to the international system and to American power because it's the most serious of the adversaries that the U.S. faces today. In terms of whether the U.S. is being distracted, I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification for two reasons. The first is that the Ukraine war actually led to a number of things that have been helpful in dealing with the China challenge, right? And so it was the invasion of Ukraine that really pushed Japan, for instance, to overhaul its defense posture, its defense strategy, and to do a variety of things with the U.S. to try to shore up their position in the Western Pacific. We saw sort of similar responses in places like Taiwan. So to the extent that there is positive energy on the side of the good guys in the Western Pacific, it has a fair amount to do with the shock administered by Ukraine. The second part is that we can have a debate about whether the U.S., whether President Biden should be spending 14% of his time or 41% of his time or whatever dealing with a particular region of the world. The challenge, though, is that I just don't think the U.S. is even having a serious conversation about what would be required to maintain a favorable military balance against China 5 to 10 years from now, even if that was the only problem in the world, which it isn't.
Okay, so one of the things, you do grand strategy, and so you're focused on, in some respects, not only the quality of our national defense and our diplomacy, but, the nature and extent and strength of our relationships and their abilities with allies. So we have, in the South China Sea, we have Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. In the Middle East, we have Israel. And in Europe, we have the NATO countries. Let's just compare those three set of allies and America's engagement with them. Are you satisfied with the way the current administration is, or what would you do to strengthen those, and which is the strongest, which is the weakest? How do you assess our ability to rely on those three sets of allies?
Maybe the first thing to say is that the countries in the Middle East are in a qualitatively different category than the other two because the U.S. doesn't have formal treaty commitments to countries in the Middle East in the way that it does in East Asia or in Europe.
Not even to Israel?
No, not even to Israel. Israel has very strong sort of informal security assurances from the United States, and it hasn't been lost on the Ukrainians that the U.S. has done more with its own military forces to defend Israel over the past year than it has done to defend Ukraine, right? And so in many ways, that it is an alliance-like relationship, but there's no formal, explicit Article 5 commitment of the sort you get in NATO or with, say, the U.S.-Japan alliance. If you look at Europe, the good news is that the U.S. Has a multilateral treaty organization there, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. It has, very high levels of interoperability with the NATO allies. It's been working with them a long, long time. The challenge is the one we discussed, which is just that, only in some countries is the urgency there to take on the threats that have emerged. In the Indo-Pacific, the challenge is a little bit different, which is that the U.S. has a number of bilateral alliances, but it doesn't have a region-wide security organization, and there are historical and geographical reasons for that. But what it means is that if China attacks Taiwan, or if China attacks U.S. bases, it's more of a pickup game in terms of figuring out who's going to be involved and who's going to be doing what. And so the major challenge the U.S. has to overcome there is sort of getting these various relationships out of their silos and getting enough cooperation across the region so that you can respond effectively and multilaterally if and when a crisis comes.
So they're really all three different. And it's funny that, you made the comment about, we're doing more explicitly to help Israel than we are Ukraine, but there's no alliance commitment there. You said because of the commitment, the formal organization of NATO, that you implied that it was stronger. And yet I sometimes feel as if Japan and Taiwan are more reliable allies than Germany and France.
Well, I guess reliable in what sense? I mean, the relationship with Taiwan is very, very important, but it's mostly a one-way relationship, right? Like there's not a huge Taiwanese contribution to U.S. security on issues that reach beyond the defense of Taiwan.
Yeah.
Japan, I think, is different, and I think it's likely that we will view Japan in this century as we saw the UK in the last century, as sort of the single most indispensable ally. But the challenge remains that we don't have the same sort of conversation between Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, Taipei, right, that we do when we go to Brussels, and we can talk to everybody in NATO, and there are very clear expectations about, what a response to a Russian invasion of the Baltic states would look like.
Okay, so last question. You've looked at all this, you're thinking about it all the time. What is the one thing you wish would happen, or the United States would do, or someone would say, that isn't being done or said?
I wish that we would have, as a nation, a more serious debate about what the proper level of defense spending and what the proper set of capabilities the U.S. military will need in the coming years. I think that, as I mentioned, I think we're not even in the ballpark of what will be required to deal effectively with three theaters of threats, and with some exceptions, we're not really even having that conversation.
But so the conversation language, I always get this. This is one of the favorite verbs in Washington is let's have a conversation about something. I agree. I'm not disparaging what your comment is, but
how about let's have somebody show some political backbone on this?
Yes. So let's have somebody come out and make a case for a much stronger national defense, and then take on all comers.
Yeah. So I think the Biden administration did a lot of good things after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the pitch that they didn't even swing at was making a really big, broad, concerted play to strengthen the defense industrial base and strengthen America's defenses. And you could have had that in the few months after February 2022 if President Biden had wanted it, and he didn't want to spend the political capital on it.
And in defense of the Republican candidate, it's in the Republican platform. They speak much more aggressively about building up our national defense. It seems to me, I hear that more from that side, which is that, do you not agree with that?
Well, the Republican candidate's platform is not what you would call policy heavy. But yeah, I mean, there has been sort of talk about a peace through strength approach. In fairness, I think there is a recognition among the Democratic national security officials that I talk to that the defense budget needs to rise, that you need, rapid investments in some key areas. The politics of it, I think, are a little bit trickier on the Democratic side than they are on the Republican side. But I think the politics of it are going to be tough regardless of who wins the presidency in November, because we're likely to have divided government after this, and that is going to lead to some very protracted discussions about debt ceiling increases, about levels of government spending, and I'm not particularly hopeful where we're going on this at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not particularly hopeful about it either, but I think I would say that it's more likely that the administration head by the Republican would be putting forth numbers that were larger in their starting point budget than in defense than the Democrat will.
I think that's probably fair.
Okay, with that, we're going to stop. Thank you very much, Hal. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
See you next time.